What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to the vlog. And it is finally here, which probably doesn't look anything like whatever. I got my R5C. So that's what I want to be talking about in today's episode. First impressions of the R5C, why I wanted the R5C, why I got an R5C, etc. I don't know if this is going to be helpful to anybody. I'm just kind of going to spitball. It's what I've seen or have and why I went this way. So I want to start with why I got an R5C. And this is obviously going to be an incredibly personal thing. You know, which cameras you buy, what cameras you want. You know, I know lots of people, you know, are going to, you know, probably go, well, you should have gone Sony or Nikon or whatever. For me, I like Canon. I like the interface. I like the way the cameras are laid out. I like the ergonomics. And this is one of those things too, where the sort of situation, how you end up where you end up in terms of camera gear, is something that can be evolving. So back when Nikon announced the Z9, I was sort of very serious, but briefly giving it a real thought, in that at that time, I only had an R5 and a 24-70 f2.8, so I did not have a huge investment in Canon mirrorless gear. Replacing my Canon DSLR gear with Canon mirrorless gear was going to be expensive, and yes, was carryover from lens, having Canon DSLR lenses and being able to use them on the mirrorless camera. But at the time, the economics were such that it was potentially reasonable for me to jump platforms, potentially to Nikon for the Z9, and it wasn't like I was would be selling a complete mirrorless system to change mirrorless systems. I had my R5, one lens. I was just kind of starting to look at getting some more glass, and it made some sense at the time. Now, I didn't do that. I stuck with Canon and subsequently bought a bunch of glass and now a second body. Now, the second part of this discussion is, how many bodies do you really need? To me, if you're going to be a professional photographer, or even as a serious amateur, you need to have two bodies. This is definitely the case if you're a professional photographer, but this is even applies when I was shooting as an amateur photographer. I did the old dance of, you upgrade to the latest and greatest camera, whatever the new one is, you keep your old one, you sell the third one that you had to finance the upgrade, and so you always had two cameras. In a lot of cases, a lot of places that, like, I traveled when I was traveling before the whole pandemic, there was the cost of getting somewhere to shoot, to do the photography, even as an amateur, was high enough that if I lost a camera while I was shooting, that was a big deal. So I wanted two cameras. Now, when I went to Yellowstone in 2018, was the first time that I had done something with two identical cameras. So I had always, like I said, done the dance of, I upgraded to the 5D Mark IV, I kept my 5D Mark III, etc. When I went to Yellowstone, I faced a huge kind of problem in planning and thinking about and trying to plan for that trip, in that I never really was thrilled with the 5D Mark III. I know there's a lot of people that like them. I know that there's a lot of people who have said that the 5D Mark IV was not really an upgrade from the 5D Mark III. And in my experience, the 5D Mark IV blew the 5D Mark III so far out of the water that I didn't want to shoot with the 5D Mark III. So I was really trying to, when I was planning that trip, I was really trying to figure out how, what camera would I put on what lens? I don't want to be switching cameras. And generally, like, if you're shooting wildlife in a situation like Yellowstone, say you have a 600 f4 and a 100 to 400, it's not really practical to, you know, I'm going to shoot with the 600 until the animal gets close, and then I'm going to take the camera off, put it on my 100 to 400 and shoot with that. Like, you kind of, you can do it. I mean, let's be honest. When it comes to simple reality with virtually everything in photography, you can find a way to do it. That it certainly is possible. But it's a lot easier if all you have to do is stop holding the camera that you have on the tripod with the big lens on it, reach down, pick up your second camera and start shooting. Or, you know, if you're shooting from a car, set the one camera down in your lap, pick the other camera up and start shooting. What I learned from that whole experience is that it is absolutely fantastic to have identical cameras. It's expensive, yes. There's no denying that. It is a luxury as a photographer to have two identical cameras to shoot with. However, when everything can be set up exactly the same way, when everything, all of the buttons are in the exact same place, when both cameras have the exact same performance, the exact same capabilities, the exact same everything, and you simply just don't have to care. You absolutely have, there's absolutely no concern. When I was in Yellowstone, there was absolutely no concern in my mind about which camera or which lens I was going to grab for a given shot, because everything was set up identically. I didn't have to think about, oh, well, if I'm using this lens, I have to remember to hit this button, not this button, because it's a different camera, or the autofocus is going to be a little bit different because it's a different autofocus system, or I can't do focus in live view, which, I mean, I used to laugh at people, total aside, I used to quietly laugh to myself at people who were out shooting like this, looking in the back of the camera in live view, and not shooting video because it seems reasonable for video. And until I found myself in weird, awkward positions where, like, I had the camera like here and I could see the screen, but I really couldn't get my eye down into the viewfinder. And if I lifted the camera up, I lost the angle for the shot and whatnot. And so the second thing I learned on that Yellowstone trip was dual pixel AF is epic, and live view is, I'm not going to say the way to shoot things because that's not really true, but it is an incredibly far more useful way to shoot things. Now, I will not, unless I'm shooting video, and in the case of the R5C or R5, I won't even do this with video. I will do this with video and use the viewfinder, but I will not generally go around shooting like this if I can avoid it, but being able to do that when you need it is certainly epic. Now, again, going back to what I was saying with Yellowstone, the R5 or the 5D Mark III and 4, autofocus on the 5D Mark IV in live view is absolutely instantaneous. It's as fast as phase detect autofocus on the regular phase autofocus on a DSLR. The contrast-ish, yeah, I mean, it is contrast-based. Autofocus that the 5D Mark III did was crap. I mean, it's slow. It was comparatively just not great. So anyway, like I said, that's always been the kind of thing that I've run into when sort of switching or thinking about planning in the past with different cameras. So now I have discovered, for me at least, having identical cameras is great. Now, the problem with identical cameras with the R5 is that the R5 is not a great video camera. It's a good video camera. It's a competent video camera. I'm not going to say it can't shoot video. It has some limitations. Okay. A lot of them I think frustrate me and a great many of other photographers, such as the 30-minute record limit. But it's a perfectly good camera in a lot of respects for shooting video. It is not a pure video camera. I wanted something, especially with this YouTube channel and doing a lot more video content in the last couple of years, I wanted something that was a pure video camera. I have been eyeing Canon cinema cameras for a long time. Now, the problem with video cameras, or Canon's cinema cameras, as it were, is that they're not high-resolution still cameras. So going back to what I said about carrying two cameras, if I want to carry two cameras and have a cinema camera for shooting video, then I'm talking about three cameras. You know, an R5, a backup R5, and a C something video camera for shooting video. Well, that's expensive and heavy and takes up a lot of space in your bag and so on and so forth. And so that's where the R5C really became super attractive to me when Canon announced it. It's functionally an R5. It's essentially the exact same camera as an R5 with a cooling unit grafted onto the back of it and the Cinema EOS operating system available for when you shoot video. Now, from a stills perspective, the only thing that I'm giving up in the camera is the in-body image stabilizer. Well, some people would cry and fret and fuss about that. Personally, it's not a big deal to me that I'm giving up the in-body image stabilizer because, well, until I got my R5, I never had a camera with an in-body image stabilizer. So I'm used to not shooting with that kind of advanced capability, whether you want to call it advanced or not. Stabilized lenses, sure. However, even in that case, like my 24-70 f2.8 wasn't stabilized, and so I would be shooting with a 24-70 f2.8 on a 5D Mark IV, completely unstabilized, and I just had to deal with the fact that there was no stabilization at all. And of course, you up the shutter speed, use a tripod, any number of all of the various techniques that you can do to shoot or deal with not having in-body stabilization or stabilization at all. So the loss of in-body stabilization on the R5C doesn't ruin it for me. Now it does make it sort of a small step down, I guess you could say, from the R5 as a still camera. But, and again, like I said, this is all kind of for me and my thought process on this and where I think this makes a lot of sense. It's a backup still camera. So yes, in a dual camera situation where I'm shooting with a 600 and a 100 to 500 or something like that, sure, I'm going to have two slightly different cameras with slightly different capabilities. The slightly different being stabilization. Not convinced that that's a huge deal, again, since, like I said, up until the R5, I only had lens stabilization anyway, and in a lot of cases didn't have that. But in my thinking is how the cameras sort of sit. The R5C becomes my backup to my still camera and my primary video camera. And my R5, which is perfectly capable of shooting video, becomes my backup to my video camera and my primary still camera. And both cameras have the functional position of everything works the same. All buttons are in the same place, at least when you're talking about in still mode. All the buttons are in the same place. All the switches are in the same place. The firmwares, at least presently, are all doing the same thing. The capabilities are all essentially the same. Everything it's a seamless transition from one camera to the other. The difference is that one's a little thicker and the eyepiece sits back a little further and you have a slightly different viewfinder. So to me, these two cameras make a ton of sense if you're the kind of person who's shooting. Now, the R5C makes a ton of sense to me in a lot of other places. It makes a ton of sense to me as a gimbal camera. It's 8K 60 frame per second capable. It's small, it's light. You can stick it on a crane or a gimbal or a drone or something like that, and you do not have a full, massive cinema camera that you're trying to fly or, maneuver, manipulate, etc. So that makes a lot of sense, especially if you can power it from the gimbal, etc. But if you're a hybrid shooter, so you're shooting stills and video, kind of like I do, then it makes a lot of sense to me in this situation as it's the still backup to your, the backup to your still camera and the primary for your video, and your R5 would be like the backup to your video camera. And so that's, like I said, that's why I went there. So let's talk a little bit about the camera. Now, I have had this camera for 12 hours as I'm doing this. I was originally going to do an unboxing video. I was desperately trying to leave it in the box, and then I would take it out of the box and give some like real first impression type impressions on the camera. I don't have the willpower to do that. At 9 o'clock last night, I was too tired to shoot a video, but I was too antsy to want to play with the new camera and start messing with it and seeing what it does and starting to use it. And I can't leave something like that in the box for 12 hours. I mean, I can leave it in the box long enough that if I have to go do something, I can go do what I have to do, but I can't leave it in the box long enough, like, it won't, you know, when, like, I can't just sit there and be like, well, I'll get to it tomorrow. Like, I had to pull it out of the box. So I've already played with this camera a little bit. I have already shot a tiny bit on it. I have already sort of started going through menus and settings and stuff and whatnot. And so these aren't obviously super first reactions. So let's talk, like I said, a little bit about the camera. Obviously the difference between the R5 and the R5C is the big chunky cooling module that is on the back of the camera and the fan that's in it. I have no idea how the fan is going to perform at this point. I do not have enough, especially at the high end of the video processing or the video recording. I haven't shot any 8K 30 or anything, 8K 60, anything like that, so I have no idea how that's gonna shake out. On low, the fan, I can barely hear it. On medium and high, it's definitely audible at the camera. Whether or not that's going to be a problem is, you know, entirely going to be dependent on the situation and the temperature and so on and so forth. One of the things that I will be looking into with this camera is how much the camera has to ramp the fan up to keep it acceptably cool when shooting these the more demanding high-resolution video modes in sort of more demanding environments. So like when it's 90-something degrees outside in the sun or something like that, because presumably the camera will get warmer, the fan will have to run harder to keep the camera cool, and that could potentially introduce unwanted audio or unwanted noise into your recordings. Now, again, how much of a deal that's actually going to be in practice is going to depend tremendously on the environment that you're recording in. So I record in a rather, you know, pretty normal residential-ish room that no special sound treatments. I have fans because this is Florida. I have an air filter that's running because this is Florida. I have air conditioners. This is Florida. Turning the air conditioner off is not really an option when it's 95 or 98 degrees out and I'm trying to shoot a video because, yeah, this is Florida. Obviously, there's places that are hotter, but all of this background noise, my computer, etc., means that at a certain point, there's just a certain noise floor in the room, and if the fan's quieter than that, then, you know, it is what it is. I will probably be looking at that, like I said, because I would like to know sort of where the range and limits are. Is it going to be, you know, loud or whatever? Is it going to end up chunking up the full power if I'm shooting somewhere? If you're shooting with a lav mic or a boom mic or something that is not, you know, attached to the camera, that's not a microphone at the camera, that noise may not be a significant issue at all. Again, sound falls off with distance, so, you know, it is what it is. It also may be possible that the camera, because, again, I don't know yet, I haven't had the time to test it, that the camera is perfectly happy running with the fan at low, which is, like I said, barely audible unless you're in a super quiet studio, and it doesn't have to ramp up any higher. You can also set it so that the fan doesn't run at all when the camera's recording unless the camera gets too hot and then it kicks on. Presumably it will also change speeds. It's not really clear. Something I have to look at. But it is what it is. And that's the price we pay in a lot of respects to the power consumption demands of shooting video. and shooting video in as stable as possible an environment. So a sensor that isn't getting hotter and hotter and hotter and changing performance characteristics is ideal or preferable when you're a serious video shooter. Now, it does say something to an extent about Canon's maybe engineering or that manufacturing, that Canon, maybe could use some updated processes for the manufacture, for example, of their processors. I don't think the sensor is matters that much. The sensors aren't made on super high, super modern processes at all. And to start with, a lot of that comes down to nothing in the sensor has to be tremendously small, so you don't need the transistor density that like modern CPUs are built with. I'm not sure that you would gain an awful lot in building a sensor in wasting the money essentially of building a sensor to say 22 nanometers or something like that instead of the 120 or 250 nanometer process that they're actually built on, because they just don't need to be the features don't need to be that small. However, the processor in the camera probably could use some of that love. Apple building their chips on TSMC's 5 nanometer or whatever they call it now, 5N, 4N process, get really good power efficiencies. And I'm not sure what process, that Canon is building. Canon, I think it's Canon and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. They are the partnership that does the silicon foundry work for the processors for Canon's chips and sensors. But this may be a call at large for Canon to find somebody who can build processors for them that are more efficient. Now, will that completely remove the need for cooling the camera? Maybe, probably not. Pretty much everything in the cinema, the proper cinema industry is actively cooled. Active cooling becomes an issue. Again, I said this, I think, in a previous video, where take 1 and take 100 can't be radically different. You can't have take 100 be noisier because the camera is hotter. So you need to have that kind of stability for Hollywood level cinematography applications. So, speaking of power, of course, which kind of, I guess that really does lead me into power, heat to power. The camera eats batteries. Good, bad, or ugly. Now, I don't have a battery grip on it, but when you're in video mode and you are even in standby, you are churning through batteries. I went through a fully charged battery in, well, I guess it probably would last a little over an hour. And I wasn't actually doing any recording with it, or I only recorded maybe 20, 30 seconds of video with it. The camera... So where the R5, when you're in standby mode, at least in photo standby mode, is running reduced resolution. It's only pulling enough data off the sensor and only processing enough data for the viewfinder or the LCD. It times itself out after a few minutes and goes to sleep. Typically, it's configurable, but typically that's what it's going to do. With the R5C, when you're in video mode, it's always running full tilt. It's always ready to record. It's always, at least as best as I can tell, it is always, it's not compromising on image quality to save some power. And so as a result, it does eat batteries. Now, part of that is that we aren't powering, it doesn't, the LPE6 that it uses is not a really huge battery. It's a 16 watt-hour battery. That's not a tremendous amount of power when you start talking about, battery performance or whatever. Now, on the topic of power, so there's a couple things. First is, and this goes back to talking too about heat and Canon's Canon's sensor or chip manufacturing, that you can't shoot 8K 60 without having supplementary power. Or I should say you can't shoot 8K 60 on the LPE6. You can shoot 8K 60 with an LPE6 and a USB power delivery battery pack or power supply powering the camera. You can shoot 8K 60 with a what is it, I don't even remember what it's called, but it's essentially the dummy battery that you plug in. You can do that with the dummy battery potentially plugged into a battery pack, because once the camera's on the dummy battery, it draws power from, it's not communicating with what's beyond that. So presumably, if you wanted to, you could run something like Anton Bauer has a PTAP-based solution for powering Canon LP-E6 battery cameras with the, from a gold mount or a V mount, or it's PTAP actually, battery, a big cinema battery. And those will, of course, provide all the power the camera needs for many hours of recording. What I would have liked to have seen, so speaking about power, the couple of comments. One thing I would have liked to have seen would have been a universal power input. Something that's on the order of the cinematography kind of standard. Everybody has the, a DC in that can do like 6 to 24 volts or something like that, so that you didn't have to, you just universal plug the thing in, power the camera. Now, of course, that would have required engineering when they were building the camera, and that actually would have had some potential implications in terms of heat and power consumption or heat generation, because you would need to have a power supply in the camera that could regulate 6 to 24 volts into the 8.4 volts or whatever that the camera actually needs. That's going to produce more heat, or can produce more heat, which goes back to the whole cooling issues and so forth and heat dissipation. So, okay, maybe that's not the best solution for the camera. The next solutions that I have kind of go back to battery grips. Now, I don't have a battery grip for this camera. I didn't order one. I'm not sure if I'm going to put a battery grip on the camera. I know it's very odd. It feels very weird to me to have a camera without a battery grip, having had battery grips on every camera I own. But there are two solutions in the battery grip park that I think Canon could implement reasonably inexpensively or cost effectively. So one would be just a battery grip that uses the same batteries as the R3 and the 1DX Mark III. So it's a bigger battery, it's higher capacity, it's higher voltage, it can deliver more current, it can deliver more power, and potentially that would be sufficient to allow the camera to run at 8K 60 without having to have an external power pack. Of course, I don't know that for certain, because I don't know, Canon didn't obviously implement that. Now, on a total tangent to power the R5C, that kind of battery grip would be, to me, a boon. I have complained for years and years and years that it's a real frustrating situation to be in if you're a Canon shooter and you own a 1DX and you own any of their, like a 5D. It's two completely separate battery systems. You have two completely separate chargers. They don't even have the 1DX or the 1D charger. They've been the same batteries essentially since the 1D Mark III. The charger for the 1DX, the R3, doesn't have the capability of charging the smaller batteries that the 5D, etc. uses. So if you're a photographer traveling with that, you're carrying two completely separate power systems that it's frustrating as hell. And this is something that Nikon would have been, or Nikon had implemented, did implement, and it really is an elegant solution of being able to use their their D4 style batteries in the battery grips for their like D850 type cameras that, I really would like to have had or have on Canon's system. Now, I would be even fine if it wasn't a retrofitted battery thing. I would be completely fine if it was a completely separate battery grip. So you have one battery grip for the R5 that is the LPE6s, two of those in the tray. You have another battery grip for the R5, R5C, same thing. They use the same battery grips. That is a R3 battery. And so if you're shooting with an R3, you know, if you're moving into that type of thing where you have an R3 for your serious action and you have an R5 for landscapes or an R5C for video, then you could get the battery grip for your R5 or R5C. You could shoot everything with the R3 battery. That's the second option. The third option would just be, to me, would be just another tray for the R5, the BGR10 battery grip, where you have a DC in on it. It has the power conversion electronics. Maybe it has a small fan or something to cool them, depending on how much power dissipation that kind of small switch mode power supply would actually have to dissipate. Plugs into the battery grip through the same contacts that the LPE6 batteries do when they're in the tray, and you have a easy external DC power supply that, quite honestly, you could put on an R5, you could put it on the R5C using the same battery grip, and it would be pretty easy interchangeable. In fact, that designing something like that would probably be simple enough that, you know, a competent, I don't want to, like, I could probably do it if I really sat down and put my mind to it, but a competent electronic engineer could bang it out in a few days with the requisite safety and so forth, and, you know, have something that just cleaned up the power delivery solution. So right now, that's kind of my biggest open question on the R5C is, how do I end up wanting to power it? Powering it off LPE6s in the hand grip is not a functional long-term solution. It burns through batteries too quick when you're shooting video. Putting a battery grip on the camera may be an option. I will probably try sticking my battery grip on the camera from my R5 and see how that performs, what kind of runtime I get with that. I think it's still going to only be, Canon says record times with the LPE6 are somewhere around 50 minutes to an hour, so the battery grip in theory would give you 2 hours. That's reasonable. It's not great. You could get by with that. Of course, there's external, there's the USB power delivery, which you could hook up to any number of things, big USB power banks, that kind of thing. I'm not sure how to mount that yet, like keeping everything in, like, I don't expect this to be the ultimate package for my R5C. I'm planning to put a cage on this. I'm planning to have rails on it, possibly a follow focus. I'm not sure about, you know, exactly the entire setup, but I'm kind of expecting this to get built out. So the question then is, if I have a USB battery pack, where does it go? You know, can I mount it under the rails so that I can have the batteries sort of like down here, put the tripod mount under that so that you could put it on a tripod, etc. There's a lot of outstanding questions that I have specifically with how I'm going to power the camera. And I mean, it's not like Canon did something bad or wrong or you know, incapable or proper. It's just now, for me at least, it's a personal problem of figuring out how to power the camera for extended runs. Actually, the funny thing is that I expect when this camera replaces the camera that I'm actually recording this on, it will be plugged into a USB power delivery AC adapter, and I expect that will be pretty much the end-all solution for a studio situation, because there's really no need to go sort of beyond that. Obviously, yes, there will be a battery in the camera, you know, that will kind of get run down, etc. But that gives a real solid, it's off AC power, so it's real solid long-term performance. What else? Firmwares. So I had secretly hoped that the way Canon implemented this. So there is a delay. Probably everybody who's already had one of these and talked about it, all the, you know, big YouTube people who talk about their cameras and the Peter McKinnons out there. There is a delay when you switch the power from photo to video. In fact, I think I can demonstrate that here. So if I go to, we'll start in photo mode. So, wait, that was video mode. So we're in photo mode, and if I flip the power switch over to video mode, you can see now, obviously you can shorten a little bit by turning off sensor cleaning, but you can see there's like a 5 or 6 second delay, 10-second delay, something like that in switching modes on the camera. It's not instantaneous to go from photo to video, basically like it is on the R5. So there is that. Now, what I was hoping with this was that because there was this delay, the way Canon would have implemented that is to put basically a photo firmware and a video firmware that you potentially would update from each side of the camera. So if you were in photo, you would switch the camera to photo mode, you would download, upload, you would put the photo firmware on your card, you would flash the camera with the photo firmware, you'd put the card in video mode, you would have the video firmware on your card, you'd flash that. And my thinking on this and the logic that I had in hoping that this would be the case is, by and large, Canon's photo cameras iterate reasonably quickly. I won't say very quickly. Sony does has a much higher pace, I should say, pace of iterating firmware updates. At least they have in the past. But Canon, we're getting firmware updates every 6 months that have some added capabilities or some significant improvements, etc. on the R5. This was the case with DSLRs. For the most part, since they went to video, there would be a number of firmware updates along the lines for advantages or improvements. The cinema cameras, in my sort of research before I bought this, tend to be a bit more sedate in that respect. And it makes a lot of sense to me. You're catering to an audience. So as a still shooter, you have everybody from the weekend warrior who just likes to take pictures all the way to the full-time professional that, is making a living purely from their photography. On the cinema side of things, you don't have the weekend warrior as much. It's not like you have just a random person who's interested in cinematography who buys, a $10,000 C300 or C500 or whatever and is going to go shoot some video on the weekend. The consequence of that from a software design, firmware design standpoint is that the firmware tends to be a little bit more stable. It tends to not iterate. It tends to not get advanced capabilities. So, for instance, the face detect autofocus, or the subject detection, I hate calling it face detection, the subject detection autofocus in video mode on the R5C is limited to people's faces. The subject detection in photo mode is capable of detecting dogs, cats, birds, cars, people, etc. Because that's the R5 firmware versus the Cinema OS firmware. On the R5, obviously, when you're shooting in video mode, it has all the same subject detection capabilities that it has in photo mode, so you could argue it's a bit more advanced. Now, the flip side is that there are some advantages to the way that the video autofocus works in video mode on the R5C, specifically with people walking out of frame and not hunting for a new thing to detect or subject to focus on until either directed to or until it detects a face that's reasonably close to being in focus, and then it will focus on the new face. So there are advantages there. But my concern of the whole thing when it comes to, as I said, the firmwares is if we continue to see updates to the R5's firmware capability for the standard, the hybrid still R5, will we see those same updates coming to the R5C with any reasonable haste, or will this end up languishing? Will I end up in this situation where the R5 and the R5C become significantly divergent in terms of capabilities because Canon doesn't want to mess with the firmware on the R5C for stability, reliability, etc. reasons, that they're more comfortable having make those adjustments on the R5. And that will remain to be seen, I think. Now, that's not to say that the cinema cameras don't get firmware updates or bug fixes. They certainly do. I'm just interested to see how well this actually shapes out. Will Canon, or will Canon, because they obviously can, will Canon keep the R5C photo capabilities in lockstep with the photo capabilities of the R5 versus allowing them to fall behind? So one final thought before I sign off and say, the next one of these videos will be shot on my R5C. It will not be shot on a 5D. So like I said, there's a little bit of a bittersweet. I have built this channel on a 5D Mark IV, and it is now getting replaced, the venerable old camera, with the R5C as my primary video camera for shooting all of this stuff. The one kind of sort of speaking about photo video type things, the one sort of frustrating-ish limitation, I'm going to say it's, and I wish they kind of had done this, or hadn't done this, is they have stripped, if you're in photo mode, they have stripped all of the video capabilities out of the camera. You have to go into video mode to shoot any video at all on the R5C. It makes sense. I'm loath to be too critical of that on the whole, but there is the capability on the R5 where, again, different market segments, I completely understand it, but there is the capability on the R5 where you can hit the video record button on the top of the camera while you're shooting stills and immediately drop into shooting video of basically your pre-configured choosing. So like on my camera, I have 4K 30, UHD, auto ISO, aperture priority kind of set up so that if I'm shooting wildlife and, you know, I'm shooting some bears and the bears get into it, I can immediately just drop back, hit video, and shoot the whole thing as video as opposed to shooting it as stills or shooting a few stills. I have the option. With the R5C, you don't have that option anymore at all. You have to flip the power switch, you have to wait the 10 seconds for the camera to reboot, and then you are in cinema mode shooting however you have the camera set up. Now, that's it about the camera. I will, you know, I've had this long running project going, talking about the R5 and how to use it, all the features, functions, etc. This will be a new project running along with that. I will be talking about the video mode on it. I will be going through the settings. I will be going through how to set things up. It's obviously going to take months, so this isn't going to be just done next week. I am not stopping the R5 project. I'm going to cover a video on that as well. Just this is kind of a much longer running, you know, or this is a new project to include in that list of projects that I have. So if you are interested in Cinema EOS OS, the Canon Cinema EOS cameras, what they do, how they work, please consider subscribing, because the R5C, I will be talking more about the Cinema OS, shooting video with the Cinema OS, the various functions and capabilities, etc. Doing some tests with the camera, probably not a ton of them. I don't know how much I have to really get into testing nitty-gritty type things, but configuration, function settings, etc. I will be talking about them in the coming months. So if you've made it this far, I know this is pretty long. Well, all these vlogs tend to be pretty long. Thank you so much for sticking around. If you thought this was interesting or informative or a little bit entertaining, or you got something out of it, please consider hitting that like button to let me know. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, if you have an R5, an R6, or considering an R5C or an R5 or an R6, and you want to know how to get more out of those cameras, please consider subscribing. I already have almost 50 videos on the R5 that you can go back and watch, and I will have probably another 50 by the time I'm done with that camera, and then who knows how long or how many I'm going to have on the R5C. But anyway, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. Also, if you know somebody who might also be interested in this, maybe they're considering one of these cameras or whatnot, please consider sharing it with them. It will help them, it will help me, and it'll help the channel. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.